We're going to leave the stage now for Deborah Mattinson, who's really one of our most exciting, I'm going to say that about everybody, one of our most exciting guests today. Just so you know what level person we're talking about here, she's been an advisor to Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the UK. So, I mean, this is somebody who's really had a deep insight in day-to-day top-level European politics. And I'm going to let you take it from there. You have the next 42 minutes, no more.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks to Philip and everybody for inviting me along. I'm really pleased to be here. And I've really enjoyed the two presentations so far. And looking forward to talking to you guys about my theme as well. What I'm going to be talking about, it's called Talking to a Brick Wall. Everybody plugs their book, don't they? I've written a book called Talking to a Brick Wall. It wasn't just about working with Gordon. It was a sort of wider thing about how politics and politicians and voters interact. So I'm going to be talking about the gap between voters and politicians, and what we can do to fill that, the kind of democratic deficit, if you like, or how we can get democracy into our democracy, I suppose. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit, because I think that a useful start point is to think, how do voters actually see politicians? Because I think if we look at that, we can start to see how big the problem is. And then that, I think, takes us neatly into what I'm calling the trust gap. Voters don't trust politicians. Well, actually, I'm not sure politicians trust voters very much either. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about New Labour. I was an advisor to Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister and when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. But actually, I first started working in politics in the late 1980s, when Labour was in opposition and Neil Kinnock was the leader of the Labour Party. And I was then involved working through the 90s up to the birth of New Labour, advising Blair and others. And I think that the New Labour successes and failures are very instrumental in all of this, the things that made it work, and in the end, the things that made it fail. Then I want to spend a few moments talking about new politics, what that might look like, how can we make it better. And then, because Philip asked me to, but because it's very relevant as well, what's the role for new media in all of this? How does it help? And actually, how does it hinder? Because I think it's not always useful. It's not always good. Or at least it's not always done well. And then a few minutes on what next. So that's what I'm going to go through. But before we do that, I want to just stop for a minute and think about how the voter sees politicians. And I'm going to turn the clock back. So I'm going to give you some findings from focus groups that I ran in the late 1980s, the first political focus groups that I ever ran in the UK. And what I asked the people to do, they were swing voters, they were people who had voted Labour in the past, the people that Labour needed to vote for them. But in a way, the party political thing didn't matter, because the problem was with politicians in a more general sense. And I asked them, I gave them all a pad and a bit of paper, and I said, I want you to draw a picture, a kind of pen portrait of a typical politician. And here is what they did. So a typical politician is, kind of looks a bit like this. Upper class, definitely male, wearing a pinstripe suit, but this kind of pinstripe suit. They are a good speaker as well, and here he is. He's sort of pontificating, he's holding forth. He drinks champagne, and he's rich. He drives a Rolls Royce. And he reads the Times, and he went to Eton, which is a very, very posh school. And as it happens, that was sort of laughable then. We do actually now have a Prime Minister who did go to Eton, but anyway. He has a yacht, probably. That's the kind of holiday that he goes on. He has a yacht. And when he's not on his yacht, he's in Barbados. He holidays in Barbados. He is also arrogant. That was the word that was most often used to describe the kind of person a politician might be. Lives in a mansion and lives in the south of England, probably London. So that was what people felt politicians might look like. It's not a very flattering picture, and you can see straight away why there might be a slight problem in the relationship. But that was then. This was in 1980, 88, I think, or something like that. So it was different then. This lady was Prime Minister. She was very stern, she wagged her finger a lot, she was quite distant, we didn't know very much about her, and that was kind of okay, actually. Voters were prepared to live with that. But now it is a bit different. You know, if she was, this happened actually long after she was Prime Minister, being on the cover of Hello, but if she was, we'd need her to be there. You know, Margaret Thatcher, as you've never seen her before, because we never saw her like that when she was Prime Minister. But now we want to know much, much more about our politicians. We expect to know everything. We want to know, assuming that they're still male, and actually the same pen portrait would generally have the politician being male, we want to know what kind of wife they have. And we'd quite like that wife to be loving and loyal and well-dressed and pretty. What kind of family? 2.4 kids. They need to be quite cute kids as well, really. We even need to know what kind of dog they have, so my focus groups tell me. Actually, ideally a Labrador. Don't ask me why, but that's what they told me. That's what they told me. So, you know, we're looking for a lot more information now than we were back in the 1980s. And how we feel about politicians is all of the above. It hasn't really changed that much, except it's now shot through with a kind of cynicism. So people said in my focus groups that I did in 2010, very differently, a politician would drive an environmentally friendly car that would be chosen for its image. Would do charity work in the constituency and then talk about it a lot. They'd support the local football team in the run-up to the election. They wouldn't necessarily be genuinely into football, but they do it in the run-up to the election. And sometimes it's shot through with pure loathing. So actually, the public really despise politicians. So they said, a politician tries to get onto Have I Got News For You? This is a sort of quiz programme that has celebrities in the UK. Here's a politician who actually later retired from politics because he'd taken to drink, as it happens. But he's there, he's on this quiz programme, Have I Got News For You, trying to be sort of popular. What else does a politician do? They feather their own nest. They're two-faced, they're shady, and they're out of touch. So it was really a very unattractive image. And it reminded me, one of the first things that I did, one of the first, in the UK, we can't do television advertising, like, I don't know if you can here in Sweden, you can in the US, and it's a big deal, but here in the UK, we can only do party political broadcasts, so everybody's given a 5-minute slot, and you can fill it with whatever you want. And one of the first films that I ever got involved in making back in the 1980s started with a bunch of people talking to the camera, different sorts of people talking about the problems in their lives, how hard it was to get a decent school for their kids, how hard it was to make ends meet, to find somewhere to live, and so on. And, you know, they were just talking at the camera, person after person after person, and then the camera pulled back, and we could see that, in fact, they were talking to a brick wall. This became one of the kind of outstanding, memorable ads of its time. And that image has always stayed with me, and that's why I called my book Talking to a Brick Wall. It wasn't really about working with these guys. It was actually about the sense that politicians are not listening to what voters have to say. So what I set out to do with the book that I wrote, and what I'm going to share with you now, is kind of two parallel stories, really. The first was about the creation of New Labour and the ups and downs of the Labour government, how New Labour won with a massive landslide because they did seem to be listening, and then how subsequently some of that ebbed away, and I'll talk a little bit about that because I think there's some good learnings. But what I also wanted to do was to talk about kind of deeper attitudinal shifts, whereby voters and politicians seemed to stop listening to each other, and what then happened. So we had this complete kind of disconnect. What then happened, actually, was that the coalition, we had a coalition government that came in 2010 when no party won an overall majority, and initially the public said, this is great. Actually, maybe they'll all talk to each other. They're not from the same party. They won't be partisan. However, that is not what's perceived to have happened. The coalition is not particularly popular. So rather than actually offering a solution to the problem, it seems to have made the problem worse. So I'll just spend a few moments talking briefly about what that means in terms of trust. And actually, I'm going to come back to the young people a little bit later. Young people are a real problem. But actually, if you look at the bottom diagram, you can see that in 2009, in terms of opinion polling, there was a bit of a watershed, which was that those satisfied overall with the way that Parliament worked dropped from being a majority to a minority for the first time ever. So a real shift, a real turnaround. And it's not just the UK. You know, here we are in Sweden. I don't actually have Swedish data, I'm afraid, because I realised I saw how people perked up when you showed your Swedish slide with Sweden at the top. Maybe Sweden would be at the top, I don't know. But this is a survey of 100 different countries and looking at which institutions are seen as most corrupt. And you can see, you know, the police in there and the media and religion and so on, but look at that great big pie there, that big slice of political parties, politicians seen by a long way as the most corrupt of organisations in more than 106 countries, actually. I said I'd come back to young people. At Britain Thinks, we've recently done quite a big survey of teenagers, which is on our website if anybody wants to have a look at it. It's very interesting in a general sense. But what we found was that the young people we spoke to had a lot of problems. Did they think politicians were the answer? Oh, well, no, they didn't, actually. Just a third thought that political parties might be able to be the answer to their problems. The parties most likely to help young people achieve, well, you know, great news for Labour. At the top of the poll, 16%. I mean, let's jump out of the window, guys. It's terrible. So a real problem with young people. And you know, here's something that one of the young people said: I would vote if they stuck to their promises. Some of them tell lies to get in, some tell the truth. You can't really tell which is going to follow what story. And the worst thing of all is we end up with a complete democratic deficit. So young people really may not bother voting at all. In our focus groups, we started off rather optimistically, actually, with a great big pile of photos of different politicians. My plan had been, let's find out which ones they like and don't like and why and so on. I gave up, actually. Here at the bottom are the pictures. You can just see them maybe fading away. They just about knew who the guy on the left was. He's the Prime Minister. They just about knew who the guy next to him was, Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London. Then it all gets a lot more murky, as you can see. Next to them, and you can just about see the picture, Nick Clegg, and beyond that, Ed Miliband. So Nick Clegg, leader of the Lib Dems, actually Deputy Prime Minister. Ed Miliband, leader of the Labour Party, completely interchangeable. Most of the people in the focus groups thought one was the other and the other was, you know, it was completely hopeless. And as one of the kids that we spoke to in Leeds in the north said, most politicians are from middle-class backgrounds. They just can't relate to people like me. Anyway, I don't take any notice of them. And this is what's really worrying. So this is a statement that's been tested many, many times about people's commitment to democracy. I believe it is the duty of every person over the age of 18 to vote at every election. We did the same survey, we repeated the survey with parents of the young people. About 3/4 of them say yes. That's not quite how many always vote, I have to say. But, you know, there's a broad, yeah, you should do it, you should do it. Some of the older ones will say, yes, you know, people died for the right, we should do it. Only half of young people. They're not going to vote. They're just not going to vote. I'll come back to that in a minute, talking about social media, because I think there's some very interesting points to make. And there was, I can't remember which of you now, if it was Philip or Stephen, but one of you had a slide showing the inverse. You know, it's young people who are using social media, it's old people who aren't. With voting, the opposite is true. It's old people who vote and young people who don't. I don't know what we can do about that. So, 3 things that would help, in my view. Being in touch, being authentic, and having a 2-way conversation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of those. So being in touch with the electorate's mood. What does that mean? It means listening to what they say, even when it takes you outside your comfort zone, which is something that a lot of politicians simply aren't prepared to do. I asked the question earlier about chief execs hearing things they might not want to hear. I think it's worse for politicians. It means politicians talking to people in the community, not just other politicians in the House of Commons or wherever. Politicians being representative. politicians actually looking a little bit like the people that they're supposed to represent? The sense is that that image of that man in the pinstripe suit with the champagne, and it hasn't changed that much. Most people feel that most politicians aren't like them. Listening, even when you don't like what you hear. Transparency and keeping promises. So some really interesting points here. One of the things that I think was very helpful for Labour in 1997, when it won with a massive landslide, was that we invented something that we called the pledge card. And we came up with 5 pledges and said to people, if Labour gets in, these are the things that we will do. And then we focused the entire advertising campaign and every means that we had on talking about these 5 things. And what happened was that as the election campaign went on, in focus groups, as we got closer to the election, I would say, OK, Labour's in opposition, been in opposition for 20 years, what would they do if they won? And people said, this, and this. They knew those 5 pledges. And there was a real sense of transparency. And I think the really interesting thing here was that, sure, people wanted the things that they were being promised, smaller class sizes in schools or whatever. But actually, what I think they were voting for was a different way of doing politics. That's what they thought they were getting. So being in touch and acknowledging mistakes. Now, here is where things started to go less well for Labour. Fast forward, 1997, we win with a massive landslide. People feel they're going to get something different. 2 terms in, we have the Iraq War. Now, the problem with Iraq, I think, is not the rights and wrongs of the war itself, but the fact that people perceived that the government had made a mistake, had acted on bad information, and then never acknowledged that. And that's the moment, I think, where people fell out of love with Labour. So, what else? Being authentic, finding your symbolic policy. Now, that's the kind of holy grail. The best person at symbolic policies was Mrs. Thatcher. A symbolic policy is a policy that sums up your take on the world, your value set, if you like. Her symbolic policy, and the one that now, decades later, if I do focus groups and say, asking about her recently when she died, for example, what did she bring to Britain? What did she do? People remember her symbolic policy. I don't know if anybody knows what it was. No, because that would be a bad one. Yes, council house sales. Council house sales. So basically what Mrs. Thatcher did was she enabled people who were living in public housing to buy their homes very cheaply. This is a massively popular policy for the people who were able to do that. But it was also a wonderfully symbolic policy because it symbolized her desire for, to have a property-owning nation, to move away from state control. It summed up everything she believed in one. So, fantastic policy. What else? You need to show whose side you're on, and that means picking your enemies. Now, Tony Blair did this by fighting with his own party, which was the right thing to do because Labour needed to prove that they had changed. Ed Miliband, who is the leader of the Labour Party right now, potentially a very interesting symbolic policy, but also potentially a very interesting way of showing whose side he was on. At the last party conference, unveiled a very interesting policy, which is forcing energy companies to keep their prices down. It remains to be seen how well that will play, but he might just have pulled it off. So you're showing whose side you're on and who you're against, and you're picking a fight. And what worked for Ed quite well in the last conference was that actually there was a big fight developed. All the energy companies said, oh, this is outrageous, you can't do this. Great, game on. Pick a fight, show who you are. So, but here's the problem, here's the catch. Because all of this, if we're going to have a new politics, if we're going to have a different way of doing politics, that doesn't just mean politicians have to be different. It means that voters have to be different too. In my book, I talk about the problem that I describe as Peter Pan politics, which is this world where voters believe that politics is something that is done to them, rather than something that they will get involved and do themselves. And I think if we can't move away from that, then we're really in trouble. We need to have a different kind of politician, sure, but actually voters themselves have to say, yep, I'm in. And at the moment, they're not quite saying that. So, yeah, okay, I'm sorry, another little book plug there. When I was writing my book in 2010, I wrote a lot of it during the election campaign, and I set up a panel of voters who I ran focus groups with every week through the campaign and asked them what they thought about what had happened in the campaign. At the end of the campaign, I convened them for a day, and I asked them not to focus on the ins and outs of party politics and what they'd just heard and what they'd seen, but to really think hard about what might make politics better. And they spent a whole day doing this, and they heard from, we had some people who came along and gave them evidence. Anyway, in the end, they came up with 10 top tips for making politics better. And I'm just briefly going to share those with you. So they're 10 top tips. So the first, and some of them I've already referred to, listen. Politicians must listen even when they don't like what they hear. Politicians must be authentic. They must be true to themselves. Politicians must admit their mistakes. When they do something wrong, they shouldn't just run in the opposite direction. They should say, yep, it's a fair cop. I made a mistake. Here's what I'm going to do about it. Politicians must show whose side they're on and pick a fight if necessary. Be brave. Be prepared to take people on to confront their enemies. Politicians must connect at an emotional level. Because in the end, if I'm the voter, it's all about me and my family, and that's really what I care about. I don't care so much about how you're going to do something. I care about what you're going to deliver. Politicians must be accountable. They had some very interesting ideas here. They quite liked the idea of politicians having to produce a kind of annual report where they said, this is what I've done, this is what I'm doing, this is what I've done this year, I've achieved these 3 things, I promised I'd do this, I've done that. They only start to get into what the public might do and the role the public have in the voter, actually when we get to idea number 7. But they did feel that they didn't know enough. They did feel that schools don't tell us enough about the democratic process, don't encourage people to engage with the democratic process, don't give them the tools they need to get involved. And they all said, we've been doing this, we've been turning up to these group discussions sort of over the last 6 weeks. Boy, we know more than we did, and we're talking about it with our families, and we're kind of energised. We need to find imaginative ways of educating the public. And politicians need to use, and maybe we'll come on to social media in a moment, but use every opportunity to share what they're doing. We need to know. And they need to be proud. They need to hold their heads up. They need to speak with pride about what they're doing. But they need to do that in a way that we can understand. And I think a lot of people felt, I tested during the course of the campaign a lot of speeches that were made during that campaign. Most often people said, it's impenetrable. I don't understand it. It's full of jargon. I don't know what that means. So use language, images, and initiatives that are accessible and down to earth. So there's their top 10 list. Just want to pause for a minute and think about social media. Does it help? No, maybe not. One of the things that social media does, and I don't know if any of you follow any politicians, I follow loads, and their tweets are laughable. I mean, they are pathetic. They are so bad at doing this. And what it does is it just reinforces what I'm calling here, rather politely, I think, the otherness of politicians, aka how weird they are, how they're interested in things that most people aren't interested in, because what they tend to tweet about is the process of campaigning. So a typical tweet that I might see on a Saturday from a politician I follow will say something like this: great day's campaigning in such and such a ward, fantastic day. You know, and I don't care. I just don't care. So when it's done badly, I think it really is problematic. I think it does 2 other things too that are negative. One of the problems that we have is the 24/7 news agenda. I mean, obviously, in some ways, it's what makes it exciting. You know, things happen fast, everything's out there, but here's the problem. The problem is that with social media, forces politicians to respond kind of on the hoof. when they often really hadn't had a proper chance to think through what their answer is. I was talking to Philip and Stephen over breakfast actually this morning, and it was Philip said, you know, politics is really complicated. Wouldn't it be great, you know, if politics could be more evidence-based and we could reflect that, how complicated it is, and respond in that way. Now, the problem is that social media actually encourages quite the opposite. It encourages poorly thought through, on the hoof response, which I think in many ways diminishes politics. Final point about social media in a negative sense is it is, in the end, very much an echo chamber, because we all choose who we're going to follow, and by and large, we follow people who we agree with. I often get, sometimes because I do quite a lot of political tweeting, as well as tweeting about business and what have you, quite often people will follow me, and then they'll send me a message saying things like, I hadn't realised you were going to say things like that, I'm now unfollowing you, because I've said something, you know, because they're, I don't know, they're a Tory, and I've said something Labourish, or they're Labourish, and I've said something that wasn't left-wing enough, or something. And so what we tend to do is we edit, and that means that we're not actually necessarily learning new things, it's only reinforcing what we already knew. So that's the downside. Here's the upside. Yes, of course it can help. It's clear, and it's simple, and it encourages politicians to be reductive. It's like a sort of chef's reduction. You know, what we need in politics is those very complex ideas distilled into something that we can get, which is maybe where the symbolic policy comes in. Actually, you know, 140 characters or a Facebook page, they do encourage you to do that. They encourage you to think, how can I get my message over in a really simple way? They also, I've just noticed a typo there, they place politicians in the community as well. One of the things that my citizens' jury that I ran in 2010 about new politics told me was that they couldn't understand why politicians had to spend so much time in Westminster talking to themselves. Why couldn't they be out in the community? In a way, you can, virtually, with social media, so that's great. But the best thing of all is that it's interactive. That's the best thing. And that's the thing I think that we all have to hold on to and think, how can we change things? Because what social media does is it's a brilliant opportunity for anybody, wherever they are, whoever they are, to get into the debate. And when it happens well, that really happens, and it is fantastic. And I see senior politicians all over the world engaging with just anybody who's sent them an interesting question. And that is fantastic, and that is worth doing. And that, I think, really could change things. So, am I optimistic about the future? This is my final thoughts, really. Post the rise and fall of New Labour, and New Labour was, it was fantastic at the time. Doing focus groups the week after the 1997 election, I was interested to do some focus groups with people that hadn't voted Labour. I couldn't find anybody who would admit to it. There was such a sort of groundswell of, you know, Labour is great. But then things went wrong. Then we had the rise and fall of the coalition government. People now feel very jaded. They're finding it quite hard to see what a solution is. And I feel that there's a big prize here for whoever can get this right, but it needs a very, very big rethink. What would that rethink look like? I think it's going to have several components. It's going to be about co-creation. It's going to be about politicians working with voters to develop solutions. It's going to be about rethinking the role of the representative. What are our representatives for? How can we get to a situation where when people think about politicians, they don't think about that guy with his yacht. They think about somebody who's a little bit like them. We've got to rethink the public commitment. We've got to say to the public, yeah, it's not just about politicians changing, you have to change too. You know, you can't have it both ways. And we've got to rethink how the two can interact. And most of all, we've also got to think, what are we going to do if it all goes wrong, other than just say sorry? And that would be a start. So, and if we don't do that, we'll be back here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah.